There's a lot going on in the world right now. And with the advent of TikTok, Instagram Reels, everything seems to be right now short term. And this plays into the quick news cycle we see right now. So take some time and let's look at things at a long form perspective and not fall into the trap. But this is the continuum. We start today's story with Argentina. Buenos Aires in early 1982 was a city showing cracks beneath its proud facade. In the cafes, coffee prices rose weekly. In the market, stalls once overflowed with fresh produce now display smaller piles. Their prices scribbled on cardboard scraps, and they were replaced daily. Argentina's economy was in a deep crisis. Inflation was spiraling past 100% annually. The peso lost value so quickly that paychecks became lighter in terms before the workers even cashed them. Factories, once symbol of Argentina's industrial power, had shut their gates or laid off a large portion of their workforce. This economic turmoil came after years of political darkness. Since 1976, the country had been ruled by a militia junta that promised to restore order and prosperity. In practice, it had waged a brutal, dirty war against their perceived political enemies, thousands of whom had been abducted, tortured, and disappeared. The junta's grip on power rested on fear, but even fear has economic misery becomes unbearable. By early 1982, the public's patience was gone. The streets were tense. The newspapers, still operating under censorship, hinted at a discontent through economic status and guarded commentary. And within the walls of the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace, a new leader was struggling to find a way out. In December 1981, General Leopold Guerrero became the third president in just 6 years of military rule. Guerrero was a career official with a reputation for toughness and a direct, uncompromising style. He inherited a country burdened with foreign debt, runaway inflation, and a public unafraid to voice their angers. The numbers were grim. Argentina owed more than $35 billion to foreign creditors, an enormous sum for the time. Interest payments devoured government resources. Industrial output was in decline. Unemployment and underemployment were growing. Even the military's own budget was strained. The junta knew that addressing the economic crisis through reform would likely make things worse in the short term and could provoke unrest that might not be able to be controlled. The alternative was to find a political distraction big enough to rally the nation and suppress the criticism. For Gilterra, the opportunity was already on the map, literally. The Falkland Islands lay south in the Atlantic, roughly 300 miles east of Patagonia, with a small population of mostly British descended sheep farmers. The islands were limited economic value, but in Argentina, they carried enormous symbolic weight. In 1833, when the British had taken control of the islands, Argentina had officially claimed sovereignty over them. School children were taught that the Falklands were a part of the nation, unjustly occupied by a distant colonial power. The dispute simmered for decades, occasionally flaring in diplomatic exchanges, but never in outright conflict. By 1982, the Argentina military leadership saw the islands as more than a point of pride. They saw them as an opportunity. Capturing them would unite the country behind the junta, distract from economic hardship, and perhaps even force the British into a negotiation settlement that could be spun as a national triumph. Gilteller's intelligence briefing suggested that the military presence on the island was minimal. The United Kingdom, facing its own economic problems and political tension under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, might not be willing to respond militarily. The gamble seemed worth taking. In the early hours of April 2nd, 1982, Argentine forces landed on the Falkland Islands under the codename Operation Rosario. They met minimal resistance from the small British garrison. By the end of the day, Argentine forces controlled the capital, Port Stanley, which they promptly renamed. Back in Buenos Aires, the news was met with an outpouring of political favor. Crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo, waving white and blue flags, singing the national anthem and cheering the junta. Newspapers ran bold headlines declaring the islands had been recovered for the fatherland. For a brief moment, the strategy worked. Economic headlines vanished from the front page, replaced by maps of the South Atlantic and stories of national pride. Quiltero stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, soaking in the admiration. The military regime, which only months before had been losing its grip, now seemed to have found a new, renewed sense of purpose and legitimacy. But every war has two sides, and the junta had underestimated the British response. In London, Margaret Thatcher, who was already facing high unemployment, low approval ratings, and political challengers, she saw the invasion as not as a distant inconvenience, but as a direct challenge to British sovereignty. Allowing Argentina to keep the islands would have been a political disaster for her. Within days, Britain began assembling a naval task force to retake the Falklands, a fleet that would sail 8,000 miles to confront Argentine forces. Public opinion in the UK, initially indifferent to the islands, rallied strongly against the invasion, as it was framed as an unprovoked act of aggression. The diplomatic window for negotiations closed quickly. The conflict was now inevitable. The Falkland Wars lasted 74 days, but in that short amount of time, it became a brutal and costly conflict. On May 2nd, 1982, a British nuclear-powered submarine, HMS Conqueror, torpedoed the Argentina cruiser General Belgrado, sinking it and killing over 300 sailors. The loss was a devastating blow to Argentina's navy and a turning point in the war. In the weeks that followed, British forces established a beachhead on the islands and began a grinding advance towards Port Stanley. The fighting took place in freezing, muddy conditions, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. For the Argentine soldiers, many of them young conscripts, the conditions were harsh, the supply lines stretched thin. Morale began to falter. Back home, initial patriotic fever gave way to unease as the scale of losses became known. Inflation and shortages, temporarily masked by war fever, continued to worsen. On June 14th, 1982, the Argentine forces in Port Stanley surrendered to the British. The Union Jack was raised over the capital once more. In Buenos Aires, the surrender shattered the junta's fragile revival. Within hours, protests erupted. The same Plaza de Mayo that had celebrated victory in April was now filled with demonstrators demanding an end to military rule. The defeat stripped the junta of the last claim to legitimacy they had. The economy was still in crisis, the international humiliation was complete, and the roar of invincibility around the armed forces had vanished. By 1983, Argentina held democratic elections. Quiltero was removed from power, later arrested, and eventually tried for both his role in the war and the human rights abuse of the Dirty War. The Falkland Wars remains one of the clearest examples in modern history of a leader attempting to distract from domestic crisis through foreign adventure. Quiltero briefly gambled, and it worked. The crowds, the flags, the chanting, the unity was real. But the wars were fought as a distraction, and they rarely solve the problems that they aim to conceal. When the war ended, Argentina's economy was still broke, the debt remained, inflation still ravaged wages. The people, once momentarily united by patriotism, turned their anger back towards those who had misled them. The Falklands were supposed to be a symbol of renewed pride. Instead, they became a symbol of how quickly political calculation can unravel, and how even the most carefully staged distraction can collapse in the face of reality. So now you know the story of the Falklands and how Argentina tried to distract from their coming economic collapse. And now we have to look at modern days. Is this so called war on crime that we're seeing in DC under Trump's regime? Is this just a distraction from our economic collapse? Inflation is rising. The job numbers, which now we can't rely on. Before, we're saying that we're losing jobs, just like unemployment was rising in Buenos Aires. Now, we haven't reached Argentina level, but are we on the way? Argentina's dirty war that they were trying to distract from led hundreds of thousands of people to go missing. Now we see that ICE is taking people and hundreds of thousands of people are going missing. Where are they going? Well, Argentina did some terrible things. They did load them into planes and drop them in the middle of the ocean, shackled. Those bodies would later wash up, and those would be the human rights that were violated by Guilterra, that he was tried for. So, the question I have is, are we seeing that again nowadays? And will this distraction work? Because throughout history, this has happened multiple times, but the distraction never seems to work long term. You may see political fever here and there, just like you saw in Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, but reality always has a way of coming around. So, go to the grocery store and look at the prices now, and you'll see inflation is up. And then just ask your neighbors. You'll see unemployment is rising too. So, why we are so focused on crime and immigration? Is this all just a distraction from the economy that's collapsing? This has been the Continuum. Thank you for listening.